Okay. All right. Well, let's go ahead and get started then. So cover crops are not something that I think is on a lot of people's radar when they're thinking about their garden. And I would say historically, cover crops have been something that's been pushed in in big ag, in the agricultural community for farmers. But I would say it's probably not until recent years, at least in my knowledge, that it's been something that's really been promoted in the gardening community for the backyard gardener. But the same benefits that large agricultural producers get from using cover crops can also benefit the backyard gardener. Now, it has to be tweaked a little bit for a smaller setting, but it's definitely advantageous. And I'll show you some of the trials and tribulations that I've had personally with cover crops as I've tried it out in my garden and things like that. And I know that a few of you have tried it, so because I've heard from you. But so hopefully, you can learn from some of my mistakes as well. That's a lot of what gardening is, right? Is learning from our mistakes and improving in that way. So, and also you can, as a sidebar, if you want to use that chat function to type a question as we're going along, I've got that open on a separate window here. So again, everyone can see my presentation, right? Give me a thumbs up if you can see my presentation. Okay, good. All right, so I guess we should start by defining what a cover crop is. A cover crop is basically something that you grow to enrich your soil. And that can look like a lot of different things. It can be a lot of different, manifests itself in a lot of different ways, but essentially you're protecting and enriching your soil. And that's why it's been adapted for, large scale farms and things like that. It's a way to, during that fallow season, after you harvest your crops in the fall, what are you going to do to protect your soil in the winter? Especially in this part of the country. So, but again, some of those same principles apply. It's not really anything new. We're not reinventing the wheel. We're just kind of tweaking it to use it in a smaller setting, in the garden setting. Now, we call it a cover crop, but I would use the term crop loosely because as most of you know, if you go back to your basic training, the definition of a weed is basically a plant that is in a location where you don't want it to be, right? So cover crops can turn into weeds. It's a crop because you're purposely planting it for a purpose, that's a little redundant, but you get my point. But at the same time, it can become a weed if it's not managed properly. So I'm going to talk a little bit about that tonight. And so hopefully you can, like I said, learn from some of my mistakes and some mistakes from my colleagues. So, all right. So let's talk about some of the benefits. Let's talk about some of the benefits first. These first two bullet points, the example I always come back to, and again, this is large scale agriculture, but the same principles would apply. Dan DeSutter is the name of, he's a farmer up near your campus, near Lafayette. And he has a field that is I think he said for 30 years, he's been practicing no-till farming, and he's been using cover crops and more recently rotational grazing. And as of right now, he's got his soil to a point where it is healthy enough that it does not require any more inputs. So he does not add fertilizer to his cornfield. He does not use herbicides. He does not use insecticides. And the idea being that his soil has reached a point where it is healthy enough that it can essentially fight off disease, it can fight off drought and pests, and the soil biology is healthy enough that it can function in such a way where he does not have to add any inputs. It takes a long time to get to that point, and it's pretty amazing. The payoff, those 30 years of work that he's put in, is that he can grow organic corn on that plot and get a huge premium for it. I mean, 10 times what you could get for normal corn, basically conventional corn. Now, I tell you that not because we're here to talk about big agriculture, but that's the end result of some of these conservation practices. In the same benefits can be had in your backyard garden. So you can reduce your fertilizer costs. When you add organic matter, you're adding nutrients to your soil, specifically nitrogen. If your soil biology is healthy, it brings beneficial organisms and insects, and it can help you fight off some of those pests and diseases and things like that, along with crop rotation and other practices like that, which we'll touch on a little bit. So, but the end goal is you improve your soil health and you improve your plant health, right? And that's really what we're after, is improving plant health ultimately, especially in the vegetable garden type setting. But there's other benefits, and this is why a lot of people do it in our region, is because it prevents soil erosion. So the soil and water districts, the Natural Resource Conservation Service, the Department of Agriculture, all offer programming to try to get people to plant cover crops over the winter, the idea being that you prevent a great deal of erosion. And if you look at the number one pollutant in our waterways, it's sediment. People think it's pesticides and herbicides and things like that, and those are dangerous, don't get me wrong, but sediment is the most prevalent pollutant that we see in our waterways in the Midwest. So so you conserve soil moisture, you can help fight off the effects of drought and things like that, protect water quality, as I mentioned, and then you add organic matter, which is adding nutrients. So those are all benefits. And we can tie these benefits into the 5 principles of soil health. So in cover crops, check a few of these boxes in some cases. So soil cover, one major principle of soil health is keeping your soil covered as much as possible, and going even further than that, keeping your soil covered with living roots. So you have living roots in your soil as much as possible. That's impossible in many cases. But crops like cereal rye, for example, which I'm going to talk about here, cover crop cereal rye, it can germinate through mid-November. There's not very many things that are germinating in mid-November. And it is green all winter and starts growing, in maybe as early as late January in some cases, starts coming out of that brief period of dormancy. So there are ways that you can keep living roots in the soil almost all year round and gain the benefits from that, which improves soil structure, improves soil health. So limiting disturbance, so tilling as little as possible, just not disturbing that soil profile helps improve soil health. Again, like I said, living roots, diversity, so crop rotations. I'm sure you've heard that it's, generally speaking, you don't want to plant tomatoes in the same spot year after year, right? You're going to have increased disease problems and things like that. So that's just one small example of crop rotations and keeping your soil on its toes in terms of, the organisms that are growing in it and things like that, and the root systems that are occupying that soil. And then the last one, integrating livestock, which is possibly challenging with the backyard garden setting, but in some cases I've seen people using poultry and backyard chickens to kind of keep that, that soil principle moving forward as well. So there are options. Well, if you think back to those benefits that I just showed you, here's hairy vetch, which is a cover crop that I'm going to show you some pictures of that I've been using. These aren't from my garden, but these are from Marion County, and Kevin Allison up there at the Soil and Water District does a lot of work with promoting cover crops in backyard gardens and in urban settings and things like that. But it creates a green mulch. If you see in the picture on the left-hand side here, that's going to suppress weeds. That's going to protect your soil. That's going to conserve soil moisture. When those raindrops, when you get those big raindrops that are hitting bare soil, it's doing a lot of damage. And it results in surface crusting, which creates further problems with water infiltration and things like that. So goes a long way towards, like I said, ultimately keeping your plants healthy. And if you look at the amount of biomass that's created, and I'll show you, like I said, a picture from my garden, a picture I just took today, actually, creates a large amount of biomass. It decomposes, adds nitrogen to your soil, and is inorganic matter at the same time. So here's a close-up view, and you can see, so in this particular raised bed garden, you're talking about 4 to 4.5 inches of green mulch is what we would call that. And that's just hairy vetch that was planted at the end of the previous growing season and terminated in the spring and just laid there, essentially. So it's going to do a great deal towards suppressing weeds, like I said, and conserving soil moisture. There are some things you need to consider. That much cover, that much green cover, can create fungus problems at times, depending on how wet the weather is and things like that. So that is one thing to keep an eye on. But I think the benefits generally outweigh the cons in this case. I noticed that there's 2 lines in the lower, looks like 2 scribbled lines in the lower right-hand side of the presentation. So I don't know what happened there. Maybe I turned my back and my kids did something. I'll blame it on them. I don't really know what happened. I'm sure it wasn't me, right? So it's kind of annoying, but anyway, we'll just work through it. So there's 10, 12, 15 commonly used cover crops. We could probably pare that down to 4 or 5 that are used in backyard garden settings. The big thing is understanding what do you want from that cover crop, because different cover crops, different plants they function differently, right? And so some plants will add nitrogen. So the hairy vetch that I showed you in the last couple of pictures, for example, it's a legume, okay? So it is pulling nitrogen from the atmosphere and essentially injecting that into the soil, into the root system of the plant, and ultimately into the soil when it decomposes. So some farmers that really go crazy with this will do calculations and estimate based on their cover crop how much nitrogen their soil is gaining. And they will add that to their calculations and say, well, that means I need that much, less fertilizer, nitrogen fertilizer for my vegetables. That's pretty sophisticated stuff, but that just shows you one of the benefits of this particular cover crop. Any of your clovers would do the same thing. Again, when they decompose, they add organic matter, which is critical. Nitrogen source there, improve soil structure. The root systems of these, especially some of these specialized cover crops that we'll talk about, can really help improve soil structure, break up some of those compacted soils, clay-rich soils, and things like that, which provides mechanisms for water to move through and nutrients and air to move to the root systems of our plants. Reduce soil erosion. All of these cover crops to some degree are going to be effective at reducing soil erosion. And that might not be a big issue for the backyard garden necessarily, but don't underestimate, like I said, the power of a raindrop. It can do a lot of damage to bare soil. And like I said, if you have any standing water, you can get surface crusting, which creates a hard barrier that keeps, future water from entering into the soil profile where it's needed. All of these, to some degree, provide weed control. They can also become weeds. So we'll touch on that in a little bit here, but really understanding the life cycle of the plant is important, depending on what cover crop you choose, and knowing exactly when to kill that to get the most benefit and create the least amount of problems down the road in terms of weeds. All of these help you manage nutrients. cereal rye is another common cover crop, and it is what's called a nitrogen scavenger. So it will, the root system of cereal rye will basically grab nitrogen from deeper depths in the soil profile and move that nitrogen up through the plant so that it's closer to the surface and more available to your vegetables and plants and things like that. So nitrogen scavenger, you have nitrogen fixers like your clovers, your hairy vetch, things like that, and then you have nitrogen scavengers that transport nitrogen from one part of the soil profile where it will be more helpful to your plants. And some of these are good at suppressing disease, and I would say especially if you're using them as part of a rotation in your garden. This, if you look at this source, it's a free online book by Sayre, and it's called Managing Cover Crops Profitably. And if you have time and you're a nerd like me, it's a really cool book, and it's really interesting to read, and it would tell you basically everything you would ever want to know about cover crops, especially in the, for the non-traditional farming, backyard gardening type setting. There's all kinds of, it's just a wealth of information. So it's an awesome resource, and like I said, it's free and it's available online, and I'd be more than happy to, I think I put the information at the end of this presentation. I'd be more than happy to share that with you if that's something you're interested in looking at. But as any other plant, there's going to be certain species that do better in our climate. Maybe it's debatable on whether we're the Midwest Corn Belt or maybe we, I would say that would be the best description on here, but we probably could identify with some of these other regions like the Mid-South and maybe some of the Southeast descriptions there as well. But as you see here, it shows you, like we were talking about, what's the purpose of that cover crop? What do you want to use it for? So if you're looking for something that's a nitrogen source, so you're going to be looking at your clovers. So like your hairy vetch, your red clover, your berseem, your crimson clover. You want something that helps build soil structure, your cereal rye, barley, sorghum, sweet clover, and things like that, and so on and so forth down the list. Weed fighter. So you're talking about something that forms a really thick stand, so like cereal rye or ryegrass, which if you're like me, the thought of purposefully planting grass in your garden makes me cringe a little bit. But that's what annual ryegrass is. It's a grass, and the purpose is to protect your soil over the winter and fight weeds. I always advocate for, your weed management for your garden or your lawn starts in the fall, the year before. So if you can, that's where these cover crops really come into play. In my garden right now, where I have the hairy vetch and cereal rye growing, there is no weeds. That is just cereal rye and hairy vetch, which could become weeds later in the summer for me, but there is nothing else growing in those beds. That's how thick it is, just to give you an idea. So I like the way this is presented a little bit better. It's more of a graphical or a graphic display of some of the benefits, but you see the different categories here: nitrogen scavenger, soil builder, erosion fighter, weed fighter, good for grazing, which isn't quite as applicable to some of our situations, but quick growth. So I've highlighted cereal rye and hairy vetch. Again, those are ones that we'll be talking about throughout, but if you look at some of the attributes of cereal rye, its scores high. I mean, it's a perfect score essentially in all of them, but good grazing. So it's a really good, it's what I refer to as a gateway cover crop. So if you're going to start using cover crops, start with cereal rye. It's one of the easiest to manage, and you get the most benefit, the most bang for your buck. Whereas if you look at hairy vetch, it does offer some other things. The one thing that's not listed on here is nitrogen fixing, which is the big thing for hairy vetch. It is like I said, pulling nitrogen from the atmosphere and making that available to the root systems and your upper layers of the soil. So I'm going to highlight a few different types of cover crops, some of the ones that are more commonly used, and we might come back to this. I guess on the left-hand side, it does say legume nitrogen source for some of these as well, which is, again, like I said, where the hairy vetch comes into play. But if you look at the second column, total nitrogen, so that's pounds per acre. If you got a good stand of that particular cover crop, that's when I said people are doing those calculations and figuring out how much nitrogen these plants are adding to their soil profile, they're using these numbers. That's a significant amount, especially on a large scale. So again, this is where you're reducing inputs, right? And I think if we can reduce the amount of fertilizer we're using, everyone wins. The other cool thing I like about this is it shows the dry matter. So some of these plants create an incredible amount of biomass. And that biomass, again, could be laid down once it's killed and be used for, it could be used for green mulch. It can be incorporated in the soil and build organic matter. It can be laid down and be used to suppress weeds and things like that, especially if you look at like the Sorghum-Sudangrass and you look at the amount of dry matter that creates. And that's actually one of the crops that's used for like biofuels, processing plants and things like that in some areas. They will grow Sorghum-Sudangrass and harvest it and burn it for fuel or for energy. Someone asked, is that cereal rye or cereal rye? It's cereal rye, just like breakfast cereal. So cereal. Okay, so another thing to think about is what, and this is again coming back to maybe a crop rotation that you're trying to work in your garden. What are you planting next year? And is it a heavy feeder or not so heavy? So obviously, a lot of you know, like things like corn and tomatoes, they're heavy nutrient feeders, especially when we're talking about nitrogen and things like that. Whereas other things like carrots, beets, radish, peas, whatever it may be, not so much. So if you've got a crop, a portion of your garden, and you want to grow tomatoes next year, or you want to grow corn, or whatever it may be, you want something that's going to load up your soil with nutrients, especially nitrogen. So in that case, you'd be looking at, let's get one of these cover crops coming in before I plant that corn or the tomatoes that's going to fix nitrogen in the soil. This is tough to do, right? I mean, we're talking about quite a bit of planning, but it's just something to think about. And it helps you kind of put, my whole point is, can we put cover crops into our vegetable garden rotation? And if we do, let's think about our cover crops that we want to use, and let's think about the crops that we want to grow and things like that to plan ahead and maybe gain the benefits from the maximum benefit from the cover crop. All right, so let me show you a tool. If I could pull it up here and move it over here. Okay. Can everyone see my browser? I've got Chrome pulled up here, the Midwest Cover Crops Council. Is everyone seeing that? Okay, good. All right, so Midwest Cover Crops Council. This is a selector tool. Now, again, I'm a nerd. I kind of like this stuff. Oddly enough, you don't want to go, if you use this tool, don't use the vegetable crop tool. It's not any good. We want to go to row crop tool. This is going to basically give us the information that we want. The cool thing about this tool is you select your state, you select your county, okay? Automatically populates a list of cover crops. And this is not an exhaustive list by any means, but these are going to be the ones that, according to their research, work best in our area. So right away, it's telling you, it's giving you all these options, and it's telling you when is the best time to try to get that cover crop established. versus kind of those fringe times when it's probably not a good idea, or you're not going to have as much luck getting those established, or maybe in some of these cases when frost seeding would be appropriate for the spring. This is dirty because I'm red and green colorblind, so I I kind of struggle with this chart sometimes, but I can usually figure it out by the time of year. But anyway, so cash crop, don't really, I mean, you can do, say you want to do, let's just do warm season vegetables. So we put in a warm season vegetable. We don't really need to mess with dates right now. You can put in, if you know the drainage characteristics of your soil. So it's Evansville, so I'll put somewhat poorly drained. That's maybe a good catch-all, I don't know. We won't worry about those other categories. But here's the other cool thing. So what are your goals for using cover crops? So let's say, number one, I want a nitrogen source. So I want a cover crop that's going to build up nitrogen in my soil for my crop the following year. But I'd also like one that does a good job of fighting erosion. And then I'd also like one that, let's see, is a good soil builder. So it's going to build my soil texture and improve that. So what this does, because we clicked nitrogen source, it basically got rid of pretty much everything but the legumes, such as your clovers, or the mixes that have those. And if you see here on the left side, it's ranked each of these according to those goals that I've put out there, okay? So a 4 is good, 3 is pretty good, 2 is decent, 1 is okay, but not great, just to give you an idea of the scale here. So if you look at these 3 clovers at the top are probably your best options if those are the particular attributes that you're trying to get from this cover crop. Okay, let's switch it up a little bit. And let's say we want a nitrogen scavenger. So we want something that can pull nitrogen that's been transported to the lower layers of the soil profile and bring it up closer to the surface where it's available. We want an erosion fighter, and you don't have to pick 3, but lasting residue, okay? See, now we've got a total different suite that's been selected here. We've got a 443, Japanese millet would be good. Pearl millet, 444, so that's a perfect match. The Sorghum-Sudangrass. But look at the times of year. Your Sorghum-Sudangrass and your Sudangrass are warm season cover crops. So those are primarily used in between a spring cool season crop and then a fall cool season crop. So maybe you want something to protect your soil in the middle of summer, then that would be a good option, as would buckwheat or something like that, although buckwheat didn't show up on here. And then there's some mixes down here, like a hairy vetch, cereal rye mix, which is what I have in my garden, and things like that. So it's kind of it's a cool tool to use. It's fun to just play around with. You can click on, so if we wanted to click on one of these, it gives you all kinds of information. Like when is the best time to terminate it? What are the best methods for terminating? Potential advantages, kind of ranks all of these different attributes, potential disadvantages. So I'm not going to go through all that, but there's a ton of information there that can be used. So it's fun to poke around on there and just take a look and see what they have. So I just wanted to introduce that to you really quick. Again, we're not going to go through all of that, but just let you know that it's a tool that's available. Okay, so let's look at a few of these different types of cover crops. One that we've mentioned quite a bit, cereal rye. So in the lower left-hand image here, this is the cereal rye that you're seeing. Now this image in the upper right-hand corner, I actually took today. This is one of my beds, and this is close to 6 feet tall in some cases. So this was, I planted last fall, planted in October. It got started. a good start in the fall, and now it's growing like crazy. Now, the catch is with this is if I wanted to have something planted tomorrow, it's not going to happen, right? So you have to think about this. So this would be, if you're going to work this in a cover crop like this into your rotation, you can terminate it early, or you can terminate it late. Now, the problem is the longer you wait to terminate it, I should really rephrase that. The longer you wait to terminate this cover crop, the more benefit you get from it in terms of its attributes. So I've done a little experiment, and you can kind of see in the lower left-hand corner here, I've played around with different methods for terminating this. I'll talk about some of those here in a second. So I used, I tarped it, just threw a tarp on it in March just to see what would happen, and it worked really well. That would be an organic option. So down here, I tilled it up, just used a hand tiller. And then this one I let grow because I just wanted to see what happens with that. So this is what it looks like. When you see these anthers coming off of this, that means it's about time to be terminated. So when that plant starts using all of its energy to produce seeds, that's when it's time to kill it. That's when it's most susceptible to killing it, basically. It's a balance, right? So like I said, the longer you leave it in, the more benefit that you get, but that means you're going to push back some of your planting dates. So just wanted to show you some of those, and I'll talk about, this is hairy vetch here, and we'll talk about that. It might be next. So hairy vetch has one of the most beautiful flowers, I think, in my opinion. I think here's a close-up, and this is a picture I took today. I just think it looks really cool. The biomass it's created by, this is kind of just a mess. It's a tangled mess of vegetation. But like I said, it's doing an incredible job of choking out all other weeds and things like that. Basically, when you get to the flowering stage with hairy vetch, that's when you want to kill it. And that's where I'm at with both of these crops. I'll probably wait till maybe late this week or early next week, and I'll come in and I'll cut them down. So I will take my hedge trimmer. I don't think my weed eater will do it, so I'll probably take my hedge trimmer and just cut them down. And then I'll use all of that biomass as green mulch in my garden. So that's another example. So Sorghum-Sudangrass, this is a warm season cover crop. Again, this is one that it grows really fast, creates an incredible amount of biomass. It's a good summer cover crop where if you've got, cool season vegetables in the spring and in the fall, you come in, maybe if you want to protect your soil and get some benefits from cover crops in that middle part, that's where you go with this. Okay. So, it almost looks like corn to some degree, and the stalks can be very thick and hard to handle. So but look at the amount of biomass that it creates here relative to these others. So someone asked, if you cut down the tops, won't the roots remain and start to grow again? That's why the timing is critical. So if you can, when the plants start to flower, essentially with cereal rye and hairy vetch specifically, that is when, if you can catch it at the right time, and you have to understand the growth phases basically of that plant, if you can catch it at the right time, you can get almost 100% kill by cutting it down. If you cut it down too early, then it will come back. So, and I'll talk more about that here in a second. So the timing is critical, and each cover crop is different. Now, there's some cover crops that are awesome because they die naturally over the winter. They winter kill. Radish is one of those, and we'll talk about that here in a second. Buckwheat is another cover crop. This would be a warm season cover crop. The one thing that's kind of cool about buckwheat is that pollinators absolutely love it. So, I mean, as you can see in this picture, it is pollinator heaven. And again, this would be one that you do, in between two cool season crops. But it's kind of a cool way to bring beneficial insects to your garden and have a nice little pollinator plot in the middle of the summer. And then you can terminate it and come back in the fall and plant your cool season crops. So that's one option. Now, buckwheat, I mean, it serves a purpose, but if you look here, it's not a great nitrogen scavenger, and it's, not a great erosion fighter or anything like that. But it does a fair job of suppressing weeds and things like that, which are a problem in the middle of summer, obviously. All right, radish. So these guys, they're out of Alabama. They have a variety that they sell that's called the Sod Buster Radish, which is just an awesome name. And it's designed to break up compacted soil layers. So as you can see in the picture on the left here, that's gonna go a long way towards breaking up those clay-rich soils that we have sometimes. Now, if you've got a really, really heavy clay, it's actually just gonna push the top of the plant up because it can't penetrate those clay layers. But it is, and this is the reason I love this one, is that you don't have to worry about killing it. It dies on its own over the winter. Once you get the first hard frost, it's done. The catch is it decomposes over the winter, and if you've got a big enough stand of it, it can get kind of stinky. So that's something to think about. If you've ever driven by a large agricultural field that they planted radish as a cover crop, you would know it because it stinks. But for most backyard gardens, that's not going to be that much of an issue. But it is, I mean, as you can see, look at the stand there. If you get a good stand, it's great at suppressing weeds. It really serves a lot of great purposes. So something to think about. And it's, this is a lower maintenance one too, because it dies on its own. This is one though that you have to get started on early. So if you wait till late October to plant radish as a cover crop, you're not going to get any benefit from it, because the plants are going to be, if they germinate at all, they'll be tiny and then they'll just die at the first frost. So this is one where you would need to get started early. So that's where maybe interseeding, maybe before you've finished harvesting all of your crops in the fall, you could come in and plant this underneath and maybe get those started a little early. So that's one option. Clover, as I mentioned, the big benefit from clover is it's a nitrogen fixer. So it's pulling nitrogen from the atmosphere and making it available to the root systems in the upper layers of the soil profile. So not going to say too much more about that. Again, this is funny because the concept of purposely planting clover in my garden kind of makes me cringe a little bit, but it's all about, I'm pulling clover, right? Because I don't want it there, but it's all about your plan and working it into your, coming up with a plan to terminate it so that doesn't become a weed. Okay, so I've mentioned a few of these. When should you use a cover crop? When it fits into your rotation. So most people are planting cover crops in the fall after they're done harvesting. The cover crop gets started in the fall, goes dormant in the case of like a cereal rye, and then comes back strong in the spring, and then you terminate it in the spring before you get ready to plant. Unless it winter kills like a radish or something like that. So, but it's all about just sitting down and kind of coming up with a plan for that cover crop. I don't recommend just diving in without thinking a little bit about how is this going to work? How am I going to terminate it in the spring? How is it going to work with the schedule of my garden and things like that? So, because like if you look at the example of my garden, the section that I've been, experimenting with and letting grow out, I'm not ready to plant tomatoes tomorrow in that section, right? And to get the added benefit of those nitrogen fixers and the nitrogen scavengers, you got to let it grow a little longer. But like I said, I've just kind of wanted to experiment with it and see what happened in my particular instance. So the winter fallow period is common, or like your Sudangrass or your buckwheat or something you plant during the summer. So there's options. Again, it's just figuring out when it fits into your system. Now, there's a lot going on here with this image, and this is from another free resource, Crop Rotations on Organic Farms. Again, this is geared probably more towards, non-traditional growers, those, vegetable crop producers and things like that. But if you look, it's really interesting to look at their 5-year plan, and they sit down and they're saying, we want to work cover crops into our mix. We want to work a crop rotation into our operation here. And you can look and you can see, so for the example, for the one straw farm here, they have, let's see here, they've worked in your rye. In this case, they've worked in alfalfa, crimson clover and vetch mix here, right before tomatoes, which again makes sense, right? Because the crimson clover is a nitrogen fixer. So it's going to load that soil up with nitrogen. Boom, you come in with tomatoes, the tomatoes can really benefit from that. Then they came in with the rye vetch mix, like what I did in my garden in the fall. Plowed that down in the spring, brassicas, so on and so forth. But you can kind of see they have a plan 5 years out, what they want to do. And in some of these, they're leaving some of the ground fallow. They're not growing anything. And some of them are more aggressive with the cover crops, whereas some are more, use them more sparingly. But again, I'm not going to go through, each one of these necessarily, but it's really interesting to look at the management strategies for some of these farms and to think about, well, how could I apply that to my vegetable garden? If you're like me, I'm not planning 5 years out for my garden. So, but it's kind of an inspiration to really sit down and think about what my plan is for my crop rotations and vegetable gardens, even with a couple raised beds. Probably the scariest thing about cover crops is how am I going to kill it? And keep it from becoming a weed that gives me problems all summer, right? And that's a great question, and that's where doing research on the cover crop that you want to use comes into play. So options, you can spray it. So that's what I did with one section of my garden. I sprayed it with glyphosate with the Roundup, and I sprayed it early. And I wanted to see how effective it would be spraying that really early. So in early March, there's not many things that you can, well, I guess there's grasses and things like that are growing, but right, those herbicides only work if the plant is growing. So that's one benefit to a cereal rye, which is growing almost year round, is if you have to, you could use an herbicide to kill it. Now, I want to use herbicides as little as possible, but I just wanted to experiment and see what happened with that. So I didn't use it on all my beds or anything like that, but it does work. And in some cases, that might be your only option, to be honest. So winter kill, if you can choose a cover crop that dies naturally over the winter, like a radish, it's a great option. You can plow it under. I know I've talked to a few of you that have gone that route and just simply till it up, plow it under. That's what I did for one section of mine, and it works. You're probably going to have to come back and hit it several times, and you're probably going to be pulling weeds, but for the most part, it works really well, and it helps incorporate that organic matter. You can pull it. You can use a roller crimper. So the woman in this picture here has a handmade crimper, and she's crimping cereal rye. So like I said, the key thing is if you understand the life cycle of cereal rye, and you can catch it when it's focusing most of its energy on producing seeds, then that's when it's susceptible to being killed by simply bending the stalk over. So in this case, she's not cutting it. She's just bending the stem, essentially, the stalk, and it kills the plant. And this is what large-scale farmers do. They have roller crimper attachments for their implements, for their equipment, and they simply roll it down. And so it lays down flat, like you can see in this picture. And that's an awesome mulch that will break down, during the growing season and suppress weeds. And you can actually plant right into that. So you just come in, make a little, whatever you're doing, depending on how you're planting, make a little row and just plant right into it. And it forms, like I said, a nice green mulch. So a sickle works well. This stuff, like I said, the cereal rye, for example, it's tough. It's pretty hardy. So you're gonna need something that can really mow it down. Plastic, so you can tarp it and choke it out, which is what I did in one section of mine, and it worked really, really well. So that's an organic option. Trimmer, mower, scalp it, whatever you need to do to cut it, basically. And but the thing is timing that right. That's the important part. So again, this is from one of my raised beds. So I came in the third week of March, I think it was, second or third week of March, and I put a tarp down and pulled it up 3 weeks later, totally dead. And I've not had any regrowth whatsoever. And if you think about that, that's not bad, because then by early to mid-April, you're ready to plant whatever you need to plant. Now, that doesn't really help you if you're trying to get those cool season vegetables in, but if you're ready to get your warm season vegetables in, you're ready to go by as early as the second or third week of April, and that's an organic option. Now, you're not getting the huge benefits from those cover crops because it's not growing as much, so you're not getting the major nitrogen fixing or nitrogen scavenging benefits as if you let it grow more, but it is forming a nice green mulch. It's going to break down and add nutrients to my soil. So that's one option. So using an opaque tarp would be an option, or cardboard, plastic, whatever you have. Solarization is basically using clear plastic to cook everything underneath it. So it's an intense greenhouse effect, heats up the soil. The added benefit to that is sometimes it can kill fungal pathogens that might have overwintered in your soil. So it can kind of, in a weird way, inoculate your soil and help kill some of those weed seeds too if it gets hot enough. So that's one benefit to doing it that way. Okay. So tilling, pretty straightforward here. In this case, in my garden, I have a hand tiller. I just tilled it up using that. Works pretty well. As you can see, though, I've got some regrowth, but it's not that big of a deal to come out and till it up again, or just pull up some of those ones that have grown again. Now, this goes against one of the soil health principles where you're trying to minimize disturbance, but it's an organic option, and you're really only you're only disturbing the top couple inches of soil to get that cover crop effectively, turned over and terminated. So I think it's a trade-off you can live with generally. Gas-powered tiller would do the same thing. And then, like I said, this is the section where I used, Roundup. And this, again, I applied mid-March. So obviously really effective, and essentially, you've got like a nice straw bed to plant into at this point. But again, you're not getting the huge benefits from that cover crop by not letting it grow to grow out a little bit more. But that's a trade-off. Okay, so this is a video, and I thought about showing it, but I'm not going to. But if you wanted to watch it, it's on YouTube. But the idea here is this guy goes into a great amount of detail about when to terminate cereal rye. And I know I'm kind of beating the cereal rye horse dead here, but like I said, it is kind of a good starter cover crop if you just wanted to get something started and try it out. This is a really informative video. It's 3 minutes long. He talks about the different growth stages. I'd highly recommend it if you want to consider growing cereal rye. Like I said, in some of those cases, I terminated my cereal rye much earlier than is recommended to get all of the benefits from that particular cover crop. But there's always trade-offs with that both ways. So you let it grow out longer, and you basically want to kill it before the seed heads start forming. or right when they start forming, because you don't want a bunch of seed heads laying down in your garden, because you're going to have problems later on, right? So just a resource there. And then this is showing hairy vetch, and it's talking about the best time to terminate that. So if you look at the different growth stages here, and then they're showing kind of the flowering stages, and it tells you roughly, in this case, your best bet is by cutting or crimping the hairy vetch at early pod set. So it's been flowering for a little while. You're starting to see those first seed pods starting to form. And again, like I said, when the plant starts to transition and use its energy and focus nutrients on forming seed, that's when it's vulnerable to being cut or crimped and can be laid down. So that's where this kind of late flowering, early pod forming stage is right when you want to catch it. The problem is, like in my garden, I'm using 2 different types of cover crops at the same time. So I'm hoping that the stars align and they can both be terminated at the same time, which that's pretty rare. But those 2, cereal rye and hairy vetch, grow similarly in terms of their stages. And so the timing's usually close enough that you can get pretty close with that. Someone asked, where do you get your cover crop seed? I order mine online, although a lot of these commonly available cover crops you can get at Superior Ag, for example. But I order mine online. There's lots of vendors out there, some that sell some really, really interesting cover crop seed mixes, which are kind of fun to look at. But the Urban Farmer is one website that I've used in the past. But I mean, there's lots of options out there, but mostly I just order them online because I'm dealing with small quantities, so it doesn't kill me on shipping or anything like that. So here's some of the references that I used. So the SARE, the Sustainable Agriculture Research and Education group, they have a ton of awesome resources on their website. So I would, that's where these free books are located. The covers are shown at the top there. So I'd highly recommend checking those out. They're just great references to have handy if you're going to try cover crops or look at that. So wanted to share some of those with you, but we covered a lot, and there's a lot more that could be covered, but I think we kind of gave you a good overview of cover crops. So if you have any questions, I'd be happy to hang around.